So what I'm going to talk about is how to build a lymphedema screening program for patients with breast cancer. So it's very much more specialized. We don't have surgeons in our program, unfortunately, but it's just how to screen for lymphedema. Why do we need screening? Because it's time to move from the impairment-based model into a screening-based model. An impairment-based model means that wait until we see the problem and then we start to deal with it. So the problem could be still treatable or not treatable, and then you start to go into all a long road of dealing with the lymphedema, which usually really at the end it stays there in one way or another. Screening-based model means let's screen from day one, even before the patient receive her treatment, and then keep following. If you see an increase in volume or symptoms or any suggestion that the patient is starting to develop lymphedema, intervene right away. Maybe at that time we will have a good results. And in order to do that, you've got to have oncologists strongly involved, not just to rely on sending the patient to physical therapy when they see the patient out back. There is no doubt that you cannot do it alone. You've got to build a team. All the previous speakers talked about that because this is the truth. You have to build a team together. And we've written about that many times, about the multidisciplinary approach. And you could collect a lot of different people, but you've got to have your surgeons with you. You've got to have physical therapy, certified lymphedema a therapist. For instance, you don't need to be an expert in lymphedema to build this program. Like Mass General, I'm a radiation oncologist. MD Anderson, the PI of the lymphedema program, is also a radiation oncologist. We have Memorial Sloan Kettering and Mayo Clinic. They are breast surgeons. Then we have the BI, and in Michigan, there are plastic surgeons. Anybody who is passionate about lymphedema, come in. And then you will build the program. We need the clinical research coordinators or research assistant. We need a statistician. We have also surgeons and medical oncologists, but this is the core people. And the most important thing that you need, funding. You can do nothing without funding. So good luck with that. But please start to build your lymphedema. All right. We need, to standardize things like Sharon said. What method of our measurements you will use, how frequent, how to quantify lymphedema, the logistics, location, where will you do that? Like we do it in the multidisciplinary clinic, when the patient just had her biopsy, proven cancer, and then we start the process with education and measurements. We've got to have a baseline measurements. I don't know how to say that, but if I read a paper without baseline measurements when you screen, the data is not right, is not accurate. And we studied this really extensively on almost 1,000 patients. If there is no baseline measurements, when you look at the volume of the arm, you will over or underdiagnose 40 to 60% of your patients. So the data is not accurate. This is very crucial. And I know in some situations, patients come from the outside. I don't know what to do with them, but it's just not accurate. Do not reinvent the wheel. Look at the previous experience from other people and then build from there. For instance, what's the optimal technique to measure lymphedema? You could choose any technique. I prefer a volume technique. So you could have the circumference, and then you put it in the in software to get you the volume. You could have the parameter. You could have BIS. I think this is very messy. I don't know why people use this thing. But there are much more simple things. We chose the parameter simple, and you get your data right away. Is it necessary to have baseline measurements? I can't stress more than that. It's so simple. We've got 1,000 patients. Cheryl talked about this morning. With 7,000 visits, you cannot have stronger data than this. And at baseline, you have 3% of your patients having more than 10% increase in volume. What does this mean? This means that if you don't know this information and you get these measurements after surgery, what will happen? Oh, this patient has lymphedema. It stays with her for life. And then you keep treating. It's not going to go away. It's her own body. It's not a swelling. It's very important. And 28% will have more than 5%. So this means that if you have patients who had already like a 9% difference without any treatment, you add a minor swelling of 2%, you cross the 10%, which we define as the time to treat. So what I'm saying is very crucial to have baselines. Deal with it. Do what you need to do. You've got to have the patients up front. And this is a study which we published that underdiagnosed or overdiagnosed 40 to 60% of the patient if we just don't have this original piece of information. How do we quantify lymphedema? We have to integrate the baseline with the measurements of the day, because the baseline will stay with you. Every time the patient comes to measure, we have to integrate that. It looks a little bit complicated, but it is not. It's just like you have the information between the right and left from baseline, and then you put this. So this is very easy. Just plug the data in the computer, and then it calculates this. How do we define lymphedema? That is the problem. We have 10 different definitions. We've got to come together and sit and say, we have to define it this way. We have to have the same language. I cannot publish a paper with 2 centimeter difference and the other one with 200 ml and the third one with 10% difference. How will we collaborate? How do we understand each other? We've got to have universal agreement on what is lymphedema. I don't like the absolute difference between right and left. It is actually wrong, because if you have 200 ml difference between right and left, these 200 ml can represent 15% increase in volume of a patient with thin arm and 3% increase in volume of a patient with large arm. So you cannot tell you have lymphedema, you have lymphedema. If a patient is large and her arm is big, 200 ml is nothing. It's like 2%. And then you define her as lymphedema and you started to treat is nonsense. Any definition with no difference, with absolute difference between right and left is nonsense. It has to be relative, and we wrote a paper about that. Relative volume change, so that's what we consider. 10% would just draw the line here. Maybe too much, maybe too little. But I think 10% has to be treated, has to be assessed. Of course, with the clinical information, etc. Less than that has to be studied. If we go with 5 to 10%, should we treat, should we not treat? It has to be studied in a randomized trial, which we are working on it. In summary, it is a multidisciplinary approach. You've got to bring everybody together, use volumetric method, enforce the use of preoperative measurements, use the relative volume change, and define lymphedema as 10%. So start here and then build from there. Thank you very much.